Good noon to all. Uh, Today is the fourth day of our season two presentation, and today I have present my topic on the two uses of language in I. A. Richard's practical criticism. This is my personal information. Introduction. I. A. Richards, in full named Ivor Armstrong Richards, he was born in 1893 and died in 1979 in England. Richards was an English critic, poet, and teacher who was highly influential in developing a new way of reading poetry that led to the new criticism and that also influenced some forms of reader response criticism. He was a founder of a new criticism. Richards was educated at Magdalen College, Cambridge. He was a lecturer in English and moral sciences there from 1922 to 1929. In that period, he wrote three of his most influential books: The Meaning of Meaning, in 1923, a pioneer work on semantics and principles of literary criticism in 1924, and practical criticism 1929, companion volumes that he used to develop his critical method. I- Ivor Armstrong Richards was a modern writer of a 20th century. His speculative and theoretical works include Science and Poetry in 1926, revised as Poetry and Sciences, Menses on the Mind, Coleridge on Imagination, The Philosophy of Rhetoric, Speculative Instruments Beyond Poetries and Complementaries. His verse has been collected in internal colloquies and news and selected poems. Two uses of language. Uh, the two uses of language is written in Ivor Armstrong Richards in his practical criticism. The two uses of language is the first one is a scientific use and the second one is emotive use. There are and, we simply to use for language to communicate. There are for Richards two kinds of belief, namely scientific and emotive beliefs. He defines scientific belief as readiness to act as true, the reference symbolized by the preposition which is believed were true. It is clear definition for science belief advanced by Richards covers all five types which I have suggested. Namely the logico-mathematical, the scientific, the metaphysical, the ethical and aesthetic, and the theological. The scientific language the scientific language is the language of science, included chemistry, physics, maths, and the and the symbol like used like sigma, alpha, sigma and delta. Richard's scientific belief corresponds to and is pertinent of his scientific use of language. That is, when a statement is made for the sake of the reference it causes, the proper responses in terms of belief is a scientific belief. If you use language scientifically, for example, if you say war is strong and my belief with respect to this statement is a scientific belief. The 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 the, scienti- the, s- the scientific language is the faithfully recalled to the object. The emotive use of language, there is a emotive belief. or emotional belief, as Richards call it in his PC. He holds that the difference between these emotive beliefs and scientific beliefs is not one degree but of kind. The emotive language is the emotive language of the poet, literature, and inner coherence. Uh, and the emotive language is the word evokes emotion. Richards maintains that emotive beliefs have nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the statements emotively believed. They are held because they are instrumental in bringing about certain desirable state of affairs, certain attitudes and emotional responses, certain imaginative satisfactions. There are two groups of emotive beliefs. The first is a general belief, an example of which in Aristotelian terminology would be how a person of a certain character would speak to act probably or necessarily. In emotive language, it is a depend on the situation because it is a maybe true, it is maybe true or false. The second is similar to Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief, and what David Parker refers to as a make belief. Richards was trying to make distinctions between actualities and feelings of actually in order to clear up a discursive misunderstanding. And his famous distinction psychological it should be noted not substantive between scientific and emotive uses of language, which asserts that prose or scientific discourse is contributed by factual statements, while poetry is constituted by pseudo statements. Uh, Emotive uses of language it included like literature and art. Richards was simply providing a way of designating then two distinct psychological relationships which may be assumed by an author or a reader toward a language that passes them. As Richard Foster believed that to be interested is to try to obtain a cognizance to do what Mr. Richards wickedly denies to poetic, expressive, and grants exclusively to science to seek the truth. The philosophy of rhetoric, for example, adumbrated a new science of language to, to correspond with how we actually use it. An intention iterated in the recent speculative instruments, where one essay urges a united studio at once more scientifically and more humanly conceived and scientific use when we use language is used for scientific purposes and it is a matter of fact and requires undistorted references and absence of fictions. Emotional belief is all that is appropriate given a need in the organism and imbalance, mental or physical, a tendency to survive toward equilibrium, and idea, no matter what the extent to which intellectual rejection takes place, any idea which can be taken as a step to its fulfillment is accepted. Emotional belief for Richards is this acceptance, this use of idea by our interest, desires, feelings, and attitudes. Richards would classify as an emotional belief one which, according to him, is distinctly different from a scientific belief. An example of such a belief would be a man will kill his wife if she provokes him into an extreme state of jealousy. An example of when we